in other words, you actually have to draft the standards. Now, I did this kind of thing in 2002, and this came up before. Then it was the approval of textbooks. And what I did then is I took a computer, a laptop, and a scanner into the mobile home where they had all the textbooks. Wasn't supposed to do that, but I did. I scanned the books, and then I went in and edited them, line by line. I found the passages that were improperly, in my view, incorrect, that took the wrong emphasis, that left out things. And I wrote replacement passages that were of similar length so they could be dropped right in the textbook without having to reformat many pages. And in my testimony I said, okay, here's my report, replace this line with that line, this line with that line, this line with that line by line by line, throughout several textbooks. That is what made the difference. And almost all the testimony to add this or take out that, in general terms, was useless. The members of the State Board of Education don't know how to respond to that kind of testimony. You have to actually write stuff. Elsewhere on this website, you will find a lecture which is I've given in different forms before. What doesn't work? What doesn't work is to demand reforms without providing the language of the reforms. I like to cite as a general example, if you take a case to court, you might win the judgment, but if you don't draft the order, if you leave it to the judge, or maybe the judge will even ask opposing counsel to draft the order, you probably won't get what you want. You may have won the case and lose, but actually lose it because you didn't draft the order. And that's true throughout politics and law. Power goes to those who do the work, and doing the work means writing the actual language. If you want a bill in Congress or the legislature to do what you want, you have to draft it. You can't just write a letter to your congressman or legislator say, do something about this. If all you do is ask some decision maker to do something for you, what he's going to wind up doing is doing something to you. You have to actually draft the language. When I was a volunteer on Capitol Hill from about 1970 to 72, I didn't come with money or control of a lot of votes, but I found that they needed staff work. I also found that a lot of the staff work that was being done for members of Congress was being done by volunteer lobbyists like myself. And of course, some of them were paid lobbyists. The way you got access and influence was to do staff work for them. One of the biggest kinds of staff work that I was asked to do was to review legislation. When members of Congress introduce 20,000 bills a year, there's no way they can read them all. There's no way their paid staffers can read them all. There's no way that they can have time to talk to other members or their staffers about what's in those bills. Most of whom are not going to be really objective. So I made myself very, very useful by reviewing legislation. I go through the bill by bill by bill, and point out the things that would be reasons for why the member that I was volunteering for should either vote for it or vote against it, or perhaps things that he might want to change. So I drafted a lot of amendments, and it wasn't very long before I was drafting entire bills. So I learned through this process how to draft legislation for the U.S. Congress. Later on, I applied similar skills to drafting legislation for the state legislature. That you can find an example of that on constitution.org. It's not that difficult. What it mostly involves, because legislation is now mostly codified, is you have to go through and find all of the provisions of previous acts would be affected by the legislation you're proposing, and identify them and pointing out how they would be changed. So if you were, let's say you have a bill that has the effect of repealing 45 provisions scattered throughout the code, you have to identify all those provisions and say they will repeal this provision, repeal that line, repeal these words, and so forth, code section by code section by code section. So what you're really doing is you're editing the code. But your bill has to do that, title and section and provision by provision. It's a research project. Now, the legislation you'll find on my website, I didn't have to do that because I wasn't stopping on any previous legislation. It was completely new. It was actually, as it turns out, it was a new way of drawing congressional districts. And there's nothing in the code already to do that. So I could just tack it on, give it a new section number, and it was all fresh, all new. But in most cases, you won't be able to do that. Now, another thing about legislation that you have to learn how to do is how to anticipate all the ways it could be misunderstood. Because the important thing about laws and legislation is that if they can be misunderstood, they will be. And probably in the worst possible way. Mm-hmm. So you have to think like either your opponents or the screw-ups that are going to have to apply this legislation and say, okay, if you turn this over to a bunch of bureaucrats, how could they screw it up? Or if you left it to opposing lawyers to litigate it, how could they twist it? Mm-hmm. This is anticipating all the ways it could be misinterpreted is a very, very advanced art. Very few lawyers know how to do this. Very few congressional staffers know how to do it. Certainly very few members of Congress know how to do it, as you can see by the work product. So all I can say is it's a skill that can be learned. It's not learned by very many people, and it needs to be learned by more people. But anyway, it's a skill I've tried to learn and to apply for in a variety of ways. This legislation is an example. Other legislation I've drafted constitutional amendments. I've started work on a whole new constitution for Texas. I've been busy.